August 22, 1942. 6 p.m. Stalingrad City Soviet Headquarters, Volga River Embankment. Temperature, 32 degrees Celsius. Alexei Chuyanov, chairman of the Stalingrad City Defense Committee, age 45, sits in his office reviewing evacuation plans that will never be implemented. Outside his window, the city continues its normal life, factories operating, streetcars running, children playing in parks. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army is 15 kilometers west, advancing steadily. Chuyanov has spent the past week preparing civilian evacuation procedures, ferry schedules across the Volga, transport assignments, priority lists for women and children. He has the boats, the organization, the manpower. He estimates 12 hours to evacuate the most vulnerable, perhaps 100,000 civilians before the German artillery reaches the city. But this morning, a telegram arrived from Moscow, from Stalin himself. For words that sealed the city's fate, Stalingrad will not be evacuated. Chuyanov would later write, "I understood in that moment that we had condemned our people to share the soldiers' fate. The window was open, but orders had bolted it shut. In 12 hours, it would close forever." This is the story of the decision that trapped 400,000 civilians in history's bloodiest urban battle. Alexei Chuyanov was born in 1897 in Saratov, on the Volga River north of Stalingrad. He joined the Bolshevik Party in 1918 during the Russian Civil War, serving as a political commissar. After the war, he rose through the party apparatus, managing industrial projects and city administration. In 1940, he was appointed chairman of Stalingrad City Defense Committee, essentially the city's chief administrator for military matters. He was responsible for coordinating between military command, party leadership, factory directors, and civilian authorities. By August 1942, Chuyanov had spent 2 years preparing Stalingrad's defenses. The city was vital to Soviet strategy, a major industrial center producing tanks, weapons, and ammunition. The Stalingrad tractor factory had converted to building T-34 tanks. The Red October steel plant supplied armor plate. The Barakati factory produced artillery. Beyond industrial value, the city bore Stalin's name. Its loss would be both strategic disaster and propaganda catastrophe. As German forces approached in late July, Chuyanov began planning for two possibilities: defense of the city with the civilian population in place, or evacuation of non-essential civilians before the battle. The decision would be made in Moscow, not Stalingrad. The question of evacuation had been debated since early August. German forces broke through Soviet defenses west of Stalingrad on August 7. By August 15, advanced German units were within 30 kilometers of the city. Chuyanov called an emergency meeting of the City Defense Committee. Present were military commanders, NKVD officers, factory directors, and party officials. The question was direct: should Stalingrad civilians be evacuated? The arguments for evacuation were compelling. Approximately 400,000 civilians remained in the city: women, children, elderly, workers not essential to defense. If battle came to Stalingrad, these civilians would be trapped in the combat zone. Evacuation was logistically feasible. The Volga River provided escape routes. Ferries could transport civilians to the eastern bank, beyond German reach. Railroad connections east were still open. Transport was available. Chuyanov estimated that with organized effort, 100,000 of the most vulnerable could be evacuated within days. But there were counterarguments. Factories needed workers to produce weapons for the front. Evacuation would signal defeat, undermining military morale. Soldiers fought harder defending a living city with families present than an empty shell. And most importantly, orders from Moscow were clear: Stalingrad must hold. The meeting ended without consensus. The decision would be made at the highest level. On August 19, Chuyanov sent a detailed report to Moscow outlining evacuation plans and requesting authorization to begin. He stressed the time factor. Every day of delay made evacuation more dangerous as German forces approached. He received no response for 2 days. On August 21, the reply came, not from the Defense Ministry but directly from Stalin. The message was characteristically brief and absolute: Stalingrad bears my name. It will be defended to the last man. The civilian population will remain. Evacuation is forbidden. Troops fight better when defending a living city. Begin immediate mobilization of all able-bodied civilians for defense construction. Chuyanov read the message 3 times, understanding its implications. Stalin's logic was cold but clear: the presence of civilians would stiffen military resistance. Soldiers would not retreat from a city full of their families. Workers would continue producing weapons under fire. The city's defense would be total. But the human cost would be staggering. Chuyanov called another meeting that evening. He informed the committee of Moscow's decision. The room was silent. Everyone understood what this meant. One factory director, an old Bolshevik who had survived the Civil War, finally spoke: "Then we will defend the city. And God help us all." August 22. The final day of the window. Chuyanov spent the morning implementing Moscow's orders. Instead of organizing evacuation, he organized mobilization. Civilians would dig anti-tank ditches, build fortifications, prepare the city for siege. Women and children would construct defensive positions. The able-bodied would be formed into militia units. But privately, Chuyanov made one last attempt. He ordered his transportation chief to maintain ferry operations across the Volga for military logistics. The unstated purpose was to provide escape routes if Moscow reversed its decision or if individual families chose to flee on their own initiative. He also quietly instructed factory directors to allow emergency leave for families with young children. These actions were technically insubordinate, but Chuyanov's conscience demanded some effort to save civilians. Throughout the day, small groups of civilians began crossing the Volga, perhaps a few thousand, those with enough initiative and resources to leave on their own. But the vast majority remained, either unaware of the danger, unable to leave, or following orders to stay. At noon, Chuyanov received reports that German aircraft had been observed conducting reconnaissance flights over the city. At 4 p.m., air raid sirens wailed for the first time. A small raid: a dozen German bombers targeting the tractor factory. Minor damage. A warning of what was coming. That evening, August 22, Chuyanov stood on the Volga embankment watching the sun set over the city. Ferries were still running. The river provided an escape route. But with every hour, the window was closing. German forces were 10 kilometers away. Their artillery would soon range the city. By tomorrow, evacuation would become exponentially more dangerous. By next week, it might be impossible. Chuyanov later described his thoughts that evening: I watched families walking along the embankment, children playing, life continuing as if war were still distant. They didn't know that in less than 24 hours, their world would end. I had the boats, the organization, the time, everything needed to save them except the one thing that mattered: permission. I was a Soviet official. I followed orders. But that night, I questioned everything I had believed about our system, our leadership, our revolution. Was this what we had fought for? To sacrifice our own people for symbolic victories? The question would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 11 p.m., Chuyanov returned to his office and drafted a final report to Moscow, requesting one last time that evacuation be reconsidered. He never received a reply. At dawn on August 23, the window closed forever. August 23, 1942. 6 a.m. The city stirred to life, factory shifts beginning, streetcars running, bakeries opening. A normal Sunday morning in wartime. At 2 p.m., air raid sirens wailed. This time, it wasn't a warning. 600 aircraft of Luftwaffe, the largest German air fleet on the Eastern Front, appeared over Stalingrad. The raid scale was unprecedented on the Eastern Front. Bombers came in waves: Heinkel 111s, Junkers 88s, Stukas. For 3 hours, they dropped high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. The Luftwaffe's target was comprehensive: factories, transportation infrastructure, residential areas, the river embankment. The goal was to destroy Stalingrad as a functioning city. Chuyanov was in his office when the bombing began. The building shook with each explosion. He ran to the window and saw the city disappearing under smoke and flame. The tractor factory was burning. The Red October plant was hit. Residential neighborhoods in the city center erupted in flames. By 5 p.m., when the bombers finally departed, over 40,000 civilians had perished. Thousands more were wounded. The city's wooden buildings burned uncontrollably. The 12-hour window had closed. The civilians who might have been evacuated were now trapped in a burning city with German ground forces approaching from the west and the Volga River behind them. In the chaos following the bombing, Chuyanov's headquarters became a disaster coordination center. Reports flooded in: the water system was destroyed, fire brigades were overwhelmed, hospitals were full of casualties, entire neighborhoods had been leveled. The ferry terminals on the Volga had been hit, several boats were sunk, others damaged. The evacuation that could have been orderly 24 hours ago was now a panicked flight under fire. Thousands of civilians rushed to the Volga embankment, desperate to cross the river to safety. But German aircraft returned, strafing the crowds. Boats were overloaded and sank. People drowned in the Volga trying to swim to the eastern shore. Chuyanov organized emergency ferries using any vessel available: military boats, civilian craft, even rafts, and makeshift flotillas. Over the next week, approximately 100,000 civilians would cross the Volga under fire, the same number that could have been evacuated safely in the 12-hour window before the bombing. But now, every crossing cost lives. German artillery reached the riverbank on August 25 and began shelling the ferries. German aircraft attacked the crossings daily. What should have been an orderly evacuation became a desperate escape under fire. Chuyanov would later estimate that 10,000 civilians perished attempting to cross the Volga in those first weeks, deaths that could have been prevented with the evacuation he had requested and been denied. By early September, approximately 300,000 civilians remained trapped in Stalingrad. The city was now a battle zone. German forces had reached the Volga in the northern suburbs on September 1, cutting the city in two. Soviet forces fought from building to building, factory to factory. The civilians trapped in the combat zone faced impossible conditions. No functioning water system. Limited food supplies. Constant bombardment. Many took shelter in basements and cellars, emerging only to search for food and water. Others were pressed into service supporting military operations, carrying ammunition, treating wounded, building fortifications under fire. The tractor factory continued operating until German forces captured it in October, with workers building tanks that went directly from assembly line to combat. Chuyanov remained in the city, coordinating what civilian services still functioned. He organized food distribution, medical care, and continued evacuation operations across the Volga under increasingly difficult conditions. His headquarters moved multiple times as German forces advanced. By late September, Soviet authorities controlled only a narrow strip of riverbank, with German positions sometimes less than 100 meters from the Volga. Every night, boats crossed under fire, taking out wounded and evacuating remaining civilians, bringing in ammunition and reinforcements. The ferries became Stalingrad's lifeline, the connection that kept Soviet forces supplied and allowed gradual evacuation of trapped civilians. The battle for Stalingrad lasted until February 2, 1943, 5 months of the most intense urban combat in history. Of the 400,000 civilians trapped in the city, approximately 40,000 perished in the initial August 23 bombing. Another 40,000 to 50,000 fell victim to subsequent bombardment, starvation, and disease during the battle. The remainder were gradually evacuated across the Volga or survived in the cellars and ruins until the battle ended. Chuyanov's evacuation operations continued throughout the battle. Every night, boats crossed the Volga. Outbound, wounded, civilians, non-essential personnel. Inbound, ammunition, supplies, reinforcements. The ferry crews became heroes of Stalingrad, civilian sailors who navigated the river under German fire night after night. Many didn't survive. Boats were sunk by artillery, bombed by aircraft, overloaded and lost. But the ferries kept running. By November, most remaining civilians had been evacuated. Those who stayed were there by choice or necessity: medical personnel, factory workers supporting the defense, families who refused to leave. When Soviet forces counterattacked in November and encircled the German Sixth Army, Stalingrad's ordeal entered a new phase. Now it was German soldiers trapped in the ruins, starving and freezing through the winter. The city that bore Stalin's name became the graveyard of the Wehrmacht's most powerful army. The question haunted Chuyanov for the rest of his life: what if the evacuation had been permitted? In his post-war memoirs, he calculated that an organized evacuation in the 12-hour window before the August 23 bombing could have saved 50,000 to 80,000 civilians, primarily women, children, and elderly, who perished in the bombing or subsequent battle. The military outcome would likely have been unchanged. Soviet forces would still have defended the city, German forces would still have attacked, the battle would still have lasted 5 months. But tens of thousands of civilians would have been spared. Stalin's logic, that civilian presence stiffened military resistance, may have been correct in narrow military terms. Soviet soldiers did fight with desperate determination to defend a living city. But the human cost was staggering. The decision not to evacuate Stalingrad represents one of World War II's most controversial command decisions. It reflects Stalin's command philosophy: accept any sacrifice for victory, subordinate all considerations to military necessity, use human life as a resource to be expended for strategic goals. This philosophy won the war. Soviet forces defeated Nazi Germany through total mobilization and willingness to accept casualties that would have broken other nations. But the victory came at a price measured in millions of lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Alexei Chuyanov survived the battle. He continued serving as Stalingrad's administrative chief through the Soviet counteroffensive and the German surrender on February 2, 1943. After the battle, he led reconstruction efforts, helping rebuild the city from ruins. He received the Order of Lenin for his wartime service but carried lifelong guilt over the civilians who died. In the 1960s, during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization period, Chuyanov wrote detailed memoirs about his Stalingrad experience. He was remarkably candid about the evacuation controversy, describing his requests to Moscow, Stalin's refusal, and his belief that the decision was wrong. His memoirs provide one of the most detailed Soviet accounts of civilians suffering in Stalingrad. He wrote, "I followed my orders. I was a loyal communist, a Soviet official, a party member for 25 years. But I knew those orders were wrong. I knew we were sacrificing our people unnecessarily. Yet I lacked the courage to disobey, to order evacuation without permission. I thought I was being a good Soviet official. Now I know I failed as a human being." Chuyanov died in 1974, never fully at peace with his wartime role. His memoirs, published partially in the 1970s, offer a rare Soviet admission of moral complexity in wartime decision-making. The evacuation controversy raises fundamental questions about wartime decision-making. Was Stalin right? Did civilian presence in Stalingrad contribute to Soviet victory? Would an evacuated city have fallen faster to German forces? Military historians debate these questions. Some argue Stalin's logic was sound, defending a living city with civilians present created determination that made the defense possible. Soviet soldiers fought knowing their families were behind them. Workers continued producing weapons under fire, sending tanks directly from factory to front line. This total mobilization may have been decisive. Others argue the military outcome would have been the same regardless. Soviet strategic decisions, refusing to surrender the city, pouring in reinforcements, maintaining the Volga supply line, determined the battle's outcome more than civilian presence. An evacuated Stalingrad would still have been defended because of its strategic importance and symbolic value as Stalin's namesake city. What's certain is the human cost. 40,000 civilians perished in the initial bombing that an evacuation would have prevented. Tens of thousands more died in the subsequent battle. These were preventable deaths. The 12-hour window existed. The means to evacuate were available. The decision not to use them was deliberate, based on military logic that valued symbolic resistance over civilian lives. Today, Volgograd, renamed from Stalingrad in 1961, preserves the memory of the battle. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex dominates the city, with its massive Motherland Calls statue visible for miles. Museums document the battle's military history in comprehensive detail. But the civilian story is less prominently told. The 40,000 who died in the August 23 bombing are remembered, but the controversy over evacuation remains sensitive in Russian historical memory. The 12-hour window when Stalingrad could have been evacuated represents a moment when different decisions might have saved tens of thousands of lives without changing the battle's outcome. It stands as a reminder that in war, the most consequential decisions are often about civilians, not soldiers. Leaders must balance military necessity against human cost, symbolic value against individual lives, strategic goals against moral responsibility. Stalin made his choice. The city bore his name, and he demanded it be defended at any cost. That cost was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, soldiers and civilians alike. The victory at Stalingrad turned the tide of World War II on the Eastern Front. It began the Red Army's march to Berlin. It proved Soviet ability to defeat the Wehrmacht. But the victory rests on a foundation of civilian sacrifice that didn't have to happen. The 12-hour window existed. It closed not because evacuation was impossible, but because it was forbidden. That decision, more than any battle, defines the human cost of Stalingrad.